Chapter 34. Russia. All the further events during this last sojourn of mine on the surface of the planet Earth, connected with the abnormal form of the usual being existence of those free-brained beings who please you, and, at the same time, many trifling incidents of all kinds which elucidated the characteristic details of their peculiar psyche, began from the following. Once, walking one morning by the said pyramids, a certain elderly being, a stranger, and in exterior appearance not a native, approached me, and greeting me in the manner customary there, addressed me with the following words. "Doctor, you will perhaps do me the kindness to allow me to be your companion on your morning walks. I have noticed that you always walk in this neighbourhood alone. I am also very fond of walking here of a morning, and as I too am quite alone here in Egypt, I venture to propose to you that I should accompany you on these walks of yours." Since the vibrations of his radiations in relation to mine appeared not acutely Otkalopanian, or, as your favourites in such a case would say, since he appeared to be sympathetic, and furthermore, because I myself had already thought of establishing here also corresponding mutual relations with someone, in order as a rest from active mentation, to converse sometimes by following only the course of freely flowing associations, I at once agreed to his proposition, and from that day forth began to spend the time of my morning strolls with him. During our further acquaintanceship, it transpired that this foreigner was a subject of that large community called Russia, and that among his compatriots he was an important power-possessing being. During these walks of ours together, it so happened that we began, why I don't know, to talk chiefly about the weak will of the free-brained beings, and about those weaknesses unworthy of them, which they themselves call vices, and to which they, particularly the contemporary beings, accustom themselves very quickly, and which finally become for them a basis, in the sense of the aim of their existence, as well as in the sense of the quality of their being manifestations. Once, during one of these conversations of ours, he, addressing me, suddenly said, "My dear doctor, in my native land during recent times, the passion for alcohol is strongly developed and widely spread among people of all classes, which passion, as you know always, sooner or later leads in general to those forms of mutual relationship which usually bring about the destruction of the century-old pillars and attainments of society. This is just why several far-sighted compatriots of mine, having at last understood all the seriousness of such a situation as had arisen in our country, collected together, in order perhaps to devise conjointly some means or other for the prevention of any catastrophic consequence. For the realization of this task of theirs, they there and then decided to found a society under the name of the Trusteeship of People's Temperance, and they chose me to be the head of this enterprise. At the present time, the activities of the trusteeship, as regards the organisation of means for the struggle against the said state evil, are in full swing. We have already done much, and we have in view to do much more." Having said this, he became a little thoughtful and continued thus. "If now, my dear doctor, you were to ask my personal opinion as to the results expected from this trusteeship of ours, sincerely speaking, I should, although I am at the head of it, find it very difficult to say anything good about it. As regards the general position of affairs of this trusteeship of ours, I meanwhile personally place my hope only in a chance. In my opinion, the whole evil consists in this, that this trusteeship is under the protection of several groups, upon whom any realization of its task just depends, But as these groups each follow their own particular aims and wishes concerning each separate question, then, over the solution of each separate question concerning the basic aim of the trusteeship, controversy always reigns. And thanks to this, day by day, instead of improving the conditions for a speedy possibility of a realisation, indeed, of the aim which has been set as a basis of this very important actualisation for my dear fatherland, there only increases among the separate members of our trusteeship all kinds of misunderstandings, personal considerations, gossip, intrigue, plots, and so on and so forth. As regards myself, personally, I have during recent times so much thought, rethought, and consulted with various people who have more or less life experience, in order to find some way or other out of the situation which has turned out so sorrowfully that I reached such a state that I nearly fell ill and was compelled by the insistence of those near to me to undertake this journey here to Egypt with the sole object of resting. But alas, now here in Egypt even, I have met with no success, because always those same black thoughts of mine give me no peace. Now, my dear doctor, that you already know approximately the gist of that affair, which was the cause for my present spiritual unbalance, I will frankly confess to you my inner thoughts and hopes which have arisen in connection with my acquaintanceship with you. The point is, he continued, that during our frequent and lengthy talks on the subject of the evil vices of people, and about the possible means for getting rid of them, I reached a full conviction of your thorough competency in questions of the subtle understanding of people's psyche, as well as in the creating of conditions for the struggle against their weaknesses. And that is why I regard you as the only man who might be the source of every kind of initiative for the organisation, as well as for the carrying out in life of the activities of the trusteeship founded there at home for the struggle against alcoholism. Yesterday morning an idea came into my head, over which I thought the whole day and evening, and it is about this that I finally decided to ask you. Would you consent to go to my country, to Russia, and, after you have seen everything on the spot that is going on there, help us to organise this trusteeship of ours in such a way that it may indeed become of that use to my country for which it was founded? He further added, your just humaneness gives me courage to address this request to you, as well as the assurance that you will not, of course, refuse to take part in the work of saving perhaps millions of people. When this sympathetic, elderly Russian finished speaking, I, having thought a little, replied that I might very possibly consent to his proposal to go to Russia, since that country might perhaps be very suitable also for my chief aim. Further, I said to him, at the present time I have but one aim, namely, specifically to clear up for myself all the details of the manifestations of the human psyche of individuals existing separately as well as in groups. Well now, for the elucidation of the state and manifestations of the psyche of large groups, Russia would perhaps be very suitable for me since, as I've understood during our talks, the disease of the passion for alcohol is spread there in your country among almost the entire population, thanks to which I shall the more often have the possibility of carrying out my experiments on various types, each separately as well as in a mass. After this talk with the important Russian being, I soon got ready, and several days after left Egypt together with him. 2 weeks later we were already in the chief place of existence of this large community, in the town of that time still called St. Petersburg. After we arrived there, my new acquaintance immediately gave himself up to his own affairs, which had very greatly accumulated during his long absence. By that time, among other things, there had already been finished there the construction of that large building, which was destined by the trusteeship to this aim of struggling against alcoholism, and my new acquaintance immediately began to apply himself to the organisation and preparation of all that was necessary for what they call there the inauguration of that building and the starting of the activities connected with it. I began, however, during that time, to go about everywhere, as is usual for me, and to frequent the beings of this city, belonging to various what are called there classes, in order to become acquainted with the characteristic particularities of their manners and customs. Well, it was then that I constated, among other things, that in the presence of the beings belonging to just this contemporary community, their, as it is called, ego-individuality began during the recent centuries to form itself particularly sharply dual. After I had constated this, and began specially to investigate this question there, I finally elucidated that this dual individuality obtained in their common presences, chiefly owing to a non-correspondence between what is called the tempo of the place of their arising and existence, and the form of their being mentation. In my opinion, my boy, you will very well understand this particularly sharp duality of the beings of this large community, if I repeat to you word for word the opinion about them of our esteemed Mullah Nasir Eddin, which he gave me personally. It is necessary for me to tell you that during the second half of this last sojourn of mine among your favourites, I happened more than once to meet that terrestrial, uniquely wise Mullah Nasir Eddin, and to have personal exchange of opinion with him on various, as it is said there, life questions. This personal meeting of mine with him, in the course of which he, with a wise saying of his, defined the real essence of the beings of that large community there, took place on one of the parts of the surface of your planet called Persia, in a locality named Ispahan, where I happened to be for my investigations concerning the most saintly activities of Ashiata Shirmash, and also for clearing up on the spot that question I needed of just how there arose for the first time the form of their so-called politeness, now everywhere existing there, and also maleficent for them. Even before my arrival in Ispahan, I already knew that the esteemed Mullah Nasir Eddin had left for the town Talyarknikum to stay with the stepson of the eldest daughter of his godfather. After I'd arrived in this latter town, I immediately sought him out, and the whole time I was there often visited him, and sitting on the roof, as was the custom in this country, we would chat together about every kind of what are called there subtle philosophic questions. Once, on the second or third day apparently, after my arrival there, on going to him in the morning, my eye was struck by an unusual movement in the streets. Everywhere there were being cleaned, swept, and hung out what are called carpets, shawls, flags, and so on. I thought, evidently, one of the two celebrated annual festivals of the beings of this community is beginning. On ascending to the roof, and having exchanged the usual greetings with our dear, most eminent and wise Mullah Nasir Eddin, I asked, pointing with my hand to what was happening in the street, what it was all about. Over his face spread his customary benevolent and, as always, enchanting grimace, which nevertheless had a slight shade of contempt, and he intended to say something, but at that moment there resounded in the street below the shouts of the town criers and the clattering of many horses. Then our wise mullah, without uttering a word, got up heavily, and having taken me by the sleeve, led me to the edge of the roof, and then, winking cunningly at me with his left eye, he turned my attention to a big cavalcade, which was rapidly galloping past, and which consisted, as I later found out, chiefly of beings who were called Cossacks, belonging to that same large community there, Russia. In the centre of this large cavalcade, there rolled by what is called a Russian phaeton, harnessed with 4 horses, driven by an unusually fat and imposing-looking coachman. This imposing exterior, also quite Russian in manner, was due to the pads put in corresponding parts under his clothes. In this phaeton sat 2 beings, one of the type of that country Persia, and the other a typical what is called Russian general. When the said cavalcade had moved off a long way, Muller first of all uttering his favourite saying, "So and so and so must be, do not do what must not be," and having also uttered his favourite exclamation, somewhat resembling "Zert," he returned to his place and suggested to me that I should do the same. Then, having arranged the still smouldering charcoal on his cauldron, he sighed deeply and pronounced the following tirade, which, as always, was not immediately understandable. Just now, in the company of a large number of well-bred turkeys, a crow of this country passed by, who, although one of the chiefs and of high rank, was yet nevertheless rumpled and badly molting. During recent times, I don't know why, high-ranking crows of this country no longer in general take a single step without those well-bred turkeys. They evidently do this in the hope that maybe, perhaps, the pitiable remains of the feathers would, owing to their being constantly within the powerful radiations of these turkeys, become a little stronger and cease to fall out. Although I understood positively nothing about what he had just said, yet already well knowing his habit of expressing himself first of all allegorically, I was not at all surprised and did not question him, but patiently awaited his further explanations. And indeed, when after he had pronounced the tirade and had thoroughly finished hubble-bubbling the water in his cauldron, he, while giving in his subsequent speech with the subtle venom which is proper to him, a definition of the whole presence and general essence of the being of the contemporary community Persia, explained to me that he compared the beings of this same community Persia to the birds, crows, while the beings of the large community Russia, who formed just that cortege which had galloped along the street, he compared to the birds turkeys. He developed this thought of his in a long dissertation thus: if we analyse impartially and sum up statistically this understanding and picturing which obtain among people of the contemporary civilization concerning the races which populate Europe, in contradistinction to other continents, and make an analogy between these races and birds, then the people who represent the very zismos of the contemporary European civilization, namely, those who arise and dwell on the continent of Europe, must infallibly be called peacocks, that is, the birds who have the most beautiful and most gorgeous exterior, while the people who dwell on other continents must be called crows, that is, the most good-for-nothing and dirty of all birds. But for those contemporary people who obtain the basis and the required conditions for their arising on the continent of Europe, and who are formed on it, but whose subsequent life, and consequently further stuffing, proceeds for some reason or other on other continents, and also for those contemporary people who, on the contrary, appear on God's earth on any continent and obtain their further stuffing under the conditions arising and reigning on the continent of Europe, no better comparison can be found than the bird turkey. This latter bird, more than all other birds, expresses a something which is neither fish, flesh, fowl, nor good red herring, but which represents in itself, as is said, a half with a quarter plus 3/4. The best representations of these turkeys are the contemporary people of Russia, and it was by these turkeys, namely, that one of the chief crows of this country was surrounded, who not long ago rapidly passed by us. These Russians, moreover, correspond ideally to this peculiar bird turkey, as the following considerations of mine show. Arising and being formed on the continent Asia, but chiefly owing to a clean heredity, organic as well as psychic, forged in the course of many centuries in conditions of existence obtained on the said continent, they become, in all respects, the possessors of the nature of Asiatic people, and consequently they should also at the present time be crows. But in view of the fact that in recent times they have all been striving hard to become Europeans, and have with intent been thoroughly stuffing themselves accordingly, they thereby, little by little, are ceasing to be crows, and as, according to several undoubtedly lawful data, they cannot turn into real peacocks, they, leaving the crows behind, and not yet reaching to the peacocks, are in themselves, as I have said, ideally turkeys. Although the turkey is a very useful bird for the household, because its meat, if of course the turkey is killed in that special way which people of old nations have there learned thanks to long centuries of practice, is better and more tasty than that of all other birds, yet, in its living state, the turkey is a very strange bird, and has a certain very special psyche, to understand which, even though only approximately, is, especially for our people with their half-passive minds, quite impossible. One of the many specific features of the psyche of this strange bird is that the turkey, why I don't know, considers it always necessary to swagger, and thus will often for no reason whatever puff himself out. Even when nobody is looking at him he swaggers and puffs himself out, though he does so in this case exclusively because of his own imagination and silly dreams. Having said this, Mullah Nasir ad-Din got up slowly and heavily, and again pronouncing his favourite saying, "So and so this must be it," but this time with the end in, "Don't sit long where you shouldn't sit," took me by the arm, and together we descended from the roof. Here, my boy, while giving the subtlety of the psychological analysis of our most wise Mullah Nasir ad-Din is due, justice demands that it should be said that if these Russians have become such exemplary turkeys, we have, in this case, to blame it only once more on those beings of the community Germany. The beings of Germany were in this case guilty owing to the fact that when they invented their famous aniline dyes, they overlooked one of the specific peculiarities of these dyes. The point is that with the help of these dyes it is possible to dye all natural colours except one only, namely genuine natural black, any other colour. And it is thanks to this lack of foresight in these German beings that the scandalous misfortune for the poor Russians came about. That is to say, it is owing to the fact that the feathers of the crows are dyed by nature, as it unsuspectingly and unexpectedly turned out, just a genuine black, which, even with these aniline dyes invented by themselves, cannot possibly be dyed any other colour owing to the said vile imperfection of these dyes, that these poor Russian crows cannot therefore possibly become peacocks. And what is worst of all, having ceased to be crows and not yet having become peacocks, they willy-nilly turn into the bird turkey, which expresses ideally as has been formulated by our dear teacher, half with a quarter plus 3/4. Well, thanks to the wise definition of the esteemed Mullah Nasir ad-Din, which he told me himself, I clearly understood for the first time why all the beings of that large community there, when they reach responsible age, become possessors of so sharply dual an individuality. But enough about this. Listen further now to the events in which I happened to take part after my arrival in the chief place of existence of the community Russia, then called St. Petersburg. As I have already said, while my acquaintance, the said important Russian, settled up his affairs which had become disorganized during his absence, I began to go about everywhere and meet beings there of different, as it said, class and position, in order to study the characteristic particularities of their manners and customs, and to make clear for myself the cause of their so-called organic need for alcohol, and the manifest consequences also of the result of its effects on their common presences. It is interesting to remark that during these meetings of mine with the various free-brain beings belonging to various castes and positions, I had already by then constated several times, and it had, after more attentive observation, became quite evident to me that the majority of them carried in themselves the germ of that particular functioning of their common presences, which had already long before been habitually arising in your favourites, owing to a certain combination of two independent causes coming from outside. The first of these causes is a common cosmic law which exists under the name of solio nensius, and the second is a sharp deterioration of the conditions of the usual being existence of the beings on some part or other of the surface of this planet of yours. I speak about that germ of the particular functioning of their common presences, which after several of their years became moulded in the presences of all beings of this community in such a usual form as had already during certain definite periods become in general inherent in them, and that has become what is called a stimulating factor for their specific manifestations, which also became proper only to free-brain beings of the planet Earth, and the totality of these manifestations among the beings of the large community was this time called there Bolshevism. I will explain to you later about this same particular functioning of their common presences. I touched upon this question in this place only to give you a representation of the already particularly abnormal conditions of being existence among which my activities among the beings of this large community flowed at this period during this sojourn of mine in their chief place of existence, St. Petersburg. Even before my arrival in this city, I had had in view to actualize one of my intentions for the fulfillment of which everything that was necessary had been already prepared by me. The point is that already long before this I had intended to set up in one or other of their great inhabited spots a something of the kind of what they call there a chemical laboratory, in which I intended, by means decided on beforehand, to proceed with special experiments on several deeply concealed aspects of their ever the same strange psyche. And so, my boy, when I had stayed in this city, and when I discovered that almost half my time there might be free, I decided to make use of the chance of being temporarily half occupied, and set about the actualization of this intention of mine. From the information I obtained, I learned that in order to set up such a laboratory there, it was obligatorily required first of all to have a permit from the local power-possessing beings, and that is why I quickly began to take steps to get this permit. The first steps I took showed me that on account of the laws which had been so long before fixed in the process of existence of this community, a permit to have the right to have one's own chemical laboratory had to be issued there by a certain what is called department of one of their what are called ministries. That is why I betook myself to that same department, but it turned out that although the staff of this department acknowledged that it was their obligations to issue that kind of permit, yet they themselves did not know how it had to be done. And they did not know this, as I later understood, simply because no one had ever applied to them for this permit, and on this account these unfortunate beings had not acquired the customary for them what is called automatic habit for the manifestation of such a being duty as theirs of this kind. Here it must in general be noticed that there during the last centuries almost every being manifestation for the fulfilment of their being duty in the presences of these beings who become power-possessing is already actualized, thanks exclusively only to the functioning of the data which are formed in them from manifold automatic repetitions of the same thing. As regards the power-possessing beings of this community, the crystallization of these peculiar automatic being data at this period of the flow of time proceeded in them much more intensely than anywhere else, and was expressed so sharply that sometimes it even seemed as if there were completely absent in them in general all data whatsoever for the immediate bringing forth of being impulses proper in general to beings. This crystallization proceeded in them, as I later elucidated, in consequence of the action of the cosmic law solio nensius, which cosmic law I some time ago mentioned to you. But as to what I said, namely, that nobody applied for a permit to the staff of the mentioned department, this by no means happened because none of the inhabitants of this chief place of existence needed a chemical laboratory. No, on the contrary, never had there been in that town so many similar chemical laboratories as at this very period of the flow of time, and doubtless all the owners of the necessary permits had procured them from somewhere or other in some or other way. They could not help having them. It was just for this that there existed in this chief place of their existence, as in general there exists in all large and small communities in times of peace, a particular, as they say, administrative body, which comprises the basic hope of a complete bliss for power possessors, which they themselves call the gendarmerie and police. One of the chief obligations of the representatives of which is to see that everyone, for every kind of enterprise there, should have a corresponding permit, and indeed it must not be supposed that the what are called lynxed eyes, beings, representatives of the said basic hope of a complete bliss for power possessors, would let anything slip by, and allow anywhere any laboratory whatever without the corresponding permit from the power possessors. A basic reason for this seeming contradiction was something quite different. It is necessary to tell you that there already in this community the attitude towards the laws and regulations fixed in the past by the beings for normal, according to their understanding, mutual relationship, and in general for ordinary existence, began to become such that only those of the ordinary beings could obtain and profit by everything to which they had objective right, who knew how to act to the contrary, i.e., against laws and regulations existing there. Of these private laboratories, such as I wished to set up, not one but thousands could there be had. It was merely necessary to know first of all what abnormal goings and comings were the practice for procuring the permits for these laboratories, and then to act in accordance with these abnormalities. I, however, on account of the short time I had stayed there, had not yet had time to make clear for myself all the subtleties of the ordinary being existence, which had begun in this community, as I said, to become particularly abnormal. That is why, when I set out to take steps to get the permit I required, there began for me those endless vexations, or, as they themselves say in such cases, the idiotic dilly-dallyings, which were also fixed not long before in the process of their being existence. And in addition, all this turned out in the end to be quite without result and unnecessary. It began with this. When I had reached the aforesaid department and addressed myself to the staff there, they all began to eye each other perplexedly and to whisper together, and several of them rummaged through fat tomes in the hope of obviously finding some written rule about the issuing of these permits. Finally, the oldest of them came towards me and importantly required from me that I should first of all bring him from a certain other department certain information concerning my personal, as they express it, loyalty. It was from just this that my further endless perambulations began, from one department to another, from, as they say, one administration to another, from one official specialist to another, and so on without end. Thus the business continued until from the so-called district officer I had to go to the so-called parish priest, and so on, all but to the official city midwife. Besides this, one of these departments, why I don't know, required that a certificate issued by another department should be stamped by a third. In one department I had to sign a certain paper, in another to answer questions having nothing to do with chemistry, while in a third it was explained to me and I was advised how I must manage with the equipment of the laboratory so as not to be poisoned, and so on and so on. It turned out, as I later elucidated, that I had been, without at all suspecting it at the time, with an official among whose obligations was that of dissuading from this abominable intention those who wished to set up chemical laboratories. But the most amusing of all was that, for obtaining this permit, it was necessary in turn to apply to those official servants who had not even the remotest notion of what in general a laboratory was. I do not know how all this would have finished if, having wasted almost 2 months, I had not myself in the end thrown up all these foolish hustlings around. I threw them all up for a reason which was not without its humour. According to the rules of all these senseless dilly-dallyings, I had to get, among others, a paper from a doctor, official also, certifying that no danger would menace my personal health from my occupation in this laboratory. I went to this official doctor, but when he first of all desired to sound me thoroughly, and for this requested me to undress entirely, so that he might tap me all over with his little hammer, I could not, of course, in any way consent. And I could not consent to this because, if I had bared myself, I should inevitably have betrayed my towel, which there on your planet I skilfully hid under the folds of my dress. And you, of course, well understand that if any one of them was to have seen it, then everyone would very soon have known that I was not a being of their planet, after which it would have become already entirely impossible to remain among them and to continue the experiments interesting to me for the elucidation of the strangeness of their psyche. That is why I went from this doctor without the paper necessary for me, and from that time I threw up everything and no longer tried to obtain a permit to set up my own laboratory. In spite of the fact that I went about there everywhere pursuing my special aim, hustling at the same time for the said permit, I nevertheless often met that important Russian, my first acquaintance, who, although he was, as I said, very busy with his own affairs, nevertheless found time to visit me or to receive me at his house. At these meetings we almost always talked only about the alcoholism in his fatherland, and about the measures for struggling with this evil. From such an exchange of opinion there each time accumulated in me more and more material, as my impartial observations and studies of all the aspects of the psyche of the local beings were crystallizing in me always newer and newer data concerning them. This important Russian laid very great weight on my considerations and remarks on what had already been done by the trusteeship of People's Temperance, and also concerning the projects of future undertakings, and was always sincerely delighted by the justice of my observations. And in the beginning, all my suggestions, which he reported at the general meeting of the trusteeship, were always accepted for actualization. But when several participants of this trusteeship accidentally learned that the initiative for many useful measures had issued from me, some foreign doctor or other, not even a European, then every kind of habitual, as it is called, intrigue and protest arose against the proposals coming from me, and also against the head of the trusteeship himself. Those guilty of all the misunderstandings which led up to this sorrowful end to such an important institution as the trusteeship, created for the welfare of all the free-brain beings of this many-millioned community, were always and in everything the learned beings of new format. The point is that, owing to the insistence of certain hereditary power-possessing beings, there were among the number of the permanent chief participants of this new institution several what are called learned physicians. They happened to be among the leaders of this trusteeship, in consequence of the fact that in the presences of the hereditary power-possessing beings of that period There had again already become finally fixed and had become the inviolable part of their essence, always the same inner overlord of theirs, maleficent for the terrestrial free-brain beings, named by them self-calming, which by itself became for those unfortunates the sense and aim of their existence. And therefore, in order not to make any being effort at all, they insisted that these learned physicians should also unfeignedly take part in this important institution of great social significance. In recent times there, why I don't know, the beings there of this profession most often become learned beings of new format. It is further also necessary to tell you that here that when from among these learned beings of new format some become power-possessing and happen to take up important responsible posts in the process of ordinary existence, they then often serve much more at the sources of every kind of subsequent misunderstanding than the hereditary power-possessing beings. And they serve as these sources of misunderstandings obviously in consequence of this, that in the common presences of these beings there are acquired, and in a particular way are interwoven, the characteristic inherencies which had already become proper to your favourites of three quite different contemporary types, namely, power-possessing beings, learned beings of new format, and the contemporary professional physicians. And so, my boy, on the initiative and insistence of several hereditary power-possessing beings of that community, especially on that of those who, although they outwardly still continue to be power-possessing, yet in inner significance are only, as they are called, emptied sand boxes, deflated gas bags, they were called to power for the business of actualizing such a serious task as the relative saving of many millions of beings similar to themselves, those genuine stuffed turkeys, or, as they would be called there, upstarts. Well, at first, these same upstarts who had by chance received power carried on among themselves alone every kind of petty intrigue proper to them. It was still for the general undertaking there only half a calamity, but when, thanks to every kind of what is called subterfuge, also proceeding from them, there also began these intrigues between all the participants of this trusteeship, and they all split into different notorious parties, which pernicious custom there for a successful actualization of every promising beginning is very widely spread. Then also such a good beginning as this trusteeship for the general welfare of contemporary free-brain beings began, as they say, to crack at the seams. Those petty intrigues of theirs proceeded in full between the separate parties as well as between the separate members of that absolutely indispensable state organisation, just at the time I arrived with my first Russian acquaintance in the chief place of existence of the said community. When these upstarts who had accidentally received power learned that many of the counsels and indications on the business of improving the organisation proceeded from me, that is, just from a professional like themselves, but who was not included in their so-called corporation, well, just then, understanding well that none of their intrigues and subterfuges could have any significance at all for me, they directed them against the head of the trusteeship chosen by themselves. It is, apropos, very interesting lightly to remark here that, although every kind of data for bringing forth various being impulses which they should have are in general feebly crystallized in the presence of these contemporary professionals there, then the data which brings forth the impulse called corporate feeling for some reason or other is crystallized and functions in them very strongly. And so, my boy, as long as I did not yet know that to be occupied with intrigues and dodges, or as sometimes they themselves still express it, mutually to get rid of each other, is already unavoidably inherent in power-possessing beings of this community, I still hoped for and patiently awaited that time when eventually the corresponding conditions would give me the possibility of actualizing my fundamental aim, namely the possibility of proceeding with the elucidatory experiments on the psyche of the terrestrial beings en masse. But when it became definitely clear to me that here in this community, under the existing conditions of reciprocal relationships, it would be impossible for me to succeed in this, and I also became convinced that it was impossible to get one's own chemical laboratory there honestly, i.e., strictly according to the laws fixed in this community, I decided to remain there no longer, but to depart, in order to seek suitable conditions for my said aim, to some other European community. When my first acquaintance, the important Russian, learned about this decision of mine, he was greatly grieved. Greatly grieved also were yet several other Russian beings who indeed wished more or less good for their fatherland, and who, during this period, had had time to become clearly convinced that my knowledge and my experience might be very useful for their fundamental aim. On the day of my suggested departure, this trusteeship was preparing to open the big building which, as I have already told you, was just designed for the aim of the struggle against alcoholism, and which the beings there on the day of its opening called by the name of their Tsar, the People's Building of the Emperor Nicholas II. On the eve of my departure, my first acquaintance, the important Russian, came to me unexpectedly, and, having sincerely expressed his regret at my departure, begged me very earnestly to postpone it for several days, so that after the consecration and opening of the said building, he might travel with me and incidentally rest a little from the recent bustle, intrigues, and subterfuges. As I had no special reason to hurry, I agreed, and postponed my departure for an indefinite time. 2 days later, the opening of this building took place, and, having the previous evening received what is called an official invitation, I betook myself to that ceremony. Well, at this general solemnity of the contemporary many-millioned community, to which came even he himself, as they call him, His Majesty the Emperor, there began there, in respect of my person, what is called Oretsnak Klinik, which, generally speaking, always flows from the totality of the surrounding abnormalities, and, being formed automatically in the psyche of every one of the free-brained beings of this ill-starred planet, holds them, so to say, in an exitless magic circle. And the further events proceeded in the following order. On the day of the said state solemnity, while the ceremony was still proceeding, my first acquaintance, the Russian, suddenly ran towards me, shoving his way through the beings who appeared there in all the blaze of various what are called orders and regimentals, and in a joyous voice told me that I was to have the happiness of being presented to His Majesty the Tsar. Having said this, and speaking rapidly, he hurried away. It turned out that at this solemnity there he had had some conversation with the Emperor about me, as a result of which it had been decided that I should be presented to him. Such a presentation to the Emperor Tsar or King is considered there as a very, very great piece of luck, and that is why my acquaintance, having received such a permission, rejoiced beyond words on my behalf. Evidently he wished by this presentation to give me great pleasure, and by this to calm his own conscience, as he considered himself to blame for my unsuccessful stay in this capital. After this event 2 days passed. On the third morning, looking by chance out of the window of my lodging into the street, I saw there quite an unusual commotion. Everyone was cleaning, everywhere there was sweeping. Many of what are called the gendarmerie and police were walking up and down. To my question as to what caused all this, our Hoon explained to me that on that day, in our street, the arrival of a very important general of that community was expected. On this same day, in the afternoon, while I was sitting at home and talking with one of my new acquaintances, The concierge of the house came running into me, agitated and bewildered, and stammering exclaimed, "His Excellency!" But he did not have time to finish before His Excellency himself entered. As soon as the unfortunate concierge saw him appear, he appeared as if struck dumb by lightning, and then, having pulled himself together, he hurriedly, as it is said there, backed out of the room. But His Noble Excellency himself, with a very friendly smile, although with a shade of what is called hauteur characteristic of all the power-possessing beings of that community at that time, came towards me, at the same time examining with great curiosity the antiques which were in my room, and shaking me in a special way by the wrist, sat down in my favourite armchair. Afterwards, continuing to examine the antiques, he said, "You will in a day or two be presented to our great autocrat, and since it is I who attend to these affairs, I have come to you just to explain to you how and what you must do on such a great and important occasion of your life." Having said this, he suddenly stood up, and approaching what is called a china figure of old Chinese workmanship which stood in a corner of my room, he explained with impulsive rapture, which thrilled his whole presence, "How charming! Where did you get this marvel of ancient wisdom?" And not ceasing to look at the said figure, and giving himself up to the feeling of his rapture, or, more strictly speaking, with all his feelings coursing together through him, he further continued, "I myself am very much interested in all ancient art, but chiefly in Chinese, and that is why, of the 5 rooms given up to my collection, 3 are filled with productions of ancient Chinese work alone." Continuing to speak in this strain about his adoration for the production of ancient Chinese masters, he without ceremony again sat down in my armchair, and began to enlarge upon antiques in general, their value, and where they are to be found. During this conversation he suddenly and hastily took his watch from his pocket, automatically looked at it, stood up quickly, and, once on his feet, said, "How vexing! I am obliged to interrupt our chat, interesting to the highest degree, as I must hurry home, where doubtless the great friend of my youth and his charming wife are already waiting for me. He is here for a short while, passing through on his way abroad from the provinces, and I have not seen him since we served in the same regiment and received different appointments, I to the court, and he to a civil post." He afterward further added, "And as regards the instructions I am required to give you, about which I had come to you, I will send my adjutant for this very day, and he will explain everything to you, and no worse than I perhaps would." After this, with fussy self-importance, he left me. And indeed, on the evening of the very same day as His Noble Excellency had promised me, one of his adjutants came to my house, who was still, as is said there, a young man, that is, a being who had only quite recently attained to responsible age. This adjutant of his who came had the very marked specific type of a terrestrial free-brain being, whom in recent times among your favourites one has often come across, and who is very well defined by the words "Mamma's and Papa's darling." This former Mamma's darling, when he arrived and began to speak to me, manifested himself at first towards me quite automatically according to the data fixed in his common presence by the rules enforcedly inculcated into him of what are called bon ton. And when a little later it became clear to his being rumination that I belonged neither to his own caste nor to a higher one, but appeared to be one of those beings who, according to the abnormal understanding of the beings of that community, are considered little higher than what are called savages, he immediately changed his tone, and again quite automatically began to manifest himself towards me according to the data for commanding and ordering about, data already fixed in the common presences of the beings of that community of that period who belonged to that caste, and he began to point out how I must enter, leave, and move, and when and what words must be spoken. Besides the fact that in the course of 2 hours he had shown me by his own example how, namely, one had to manifest, he declared to me that he would return on the morrow, and he ordered me to practice so that, as he expressed himself, no misunderstandings at all might arise which might lead to where even Makar did not drive his goats. When on the day of my, as they call it, supreme presentation, I arrived there where the chief of this large community had the place of his residence, I was met at the railway station itself by His High Excellency in person, who had arrived there accompanied by 5 or 6 of his adjutants, and from that moment he himself began, of course quite without the participation of, as it is called, his personal subjective initiative, but guided only by automatic habit acquired by him, thanks to the doing of always one and the same thing, to subjugate all my separate spiritualized parts and all the self-manifestations of my common presence, taking it as it were under the directive of his own I. From this moment I had, in the sense of my outer manifestations, as our esteemed Mullah Nasir ad-Din would say, to dance in everything to his tune. As soon as we had left the station and were seated in the carriage, he immediately began to show me and to prompt me as to what and how I had to act and speak and what I had not to do or say. And when later, in that hall where the celebrated presentation took place, he further showed and directed my presence. About this we can neither speak now in the language of a Shesharade, nor describe it with the pen of a Mr. Canianson. In the hall, every movement, every step I made, even to the blinking of my eyelids, was seen in advance and prompted to me by this important general. However, in spite of all the absurdity of this procedure, if one takes into account that the perfection of a being depends on the quality and quantity of his inner experiencings, then objective justice demands that due must be given for this to your favourites, that on that day they compelled me, of course unconsciously, to undergo, and to feel perhaps more than I had undergone and felt during all the centuries of my personal sojourn there among them. However that may be, I must yet say that, having agreed to this famous presentation for the purpose of observation and investigation of the peculiar and such a contorted psyche of your favourites, and after all the great agitation which I had lived through on that day, I finally breathed freely only in the carriage of the train after my tormentors, particularly that important general, had left me alone by myself. In the course of the whole of that day I was so occupied with the fulfilment of all the innumerable foolish manipulations required from me, and which fatigued me in view of my declining years, that I did not even notice what the unfortunate emperor there looked like, or how he manifested himself in this comedy. Now, my boy, if you will strive to assimilate well the information about the subsequent events which happened to me, and which were the results of this famous presentation of mine to His Majesty the Emperor, then you will probably acquire the possibility of clearly picturing to yourself, and well understand how, there among your favourites, particularly in this large community Russia at that period, their what is called individual significance, particularly in recent centuries, began to be appraised and be built up for the majority of these unfortunates always exclusively on the basis of the outer ephemeral, as they are called, vitro nel, as, in the given case, it similarly took place in relation to me. This gradual acquiring of the habit of judging the merits of beings according to the outer ephemeral appearance in all other beings, developed and continued to develop their imagination, which became strengthened about this, that just in this consists the acquisition of being individuality, and all begun subjectively to strive only for this. That is why at the present time all of them, from the very beginning of their arising, gradually lose from their common presences even the taste and desire for what is called objective being. The manifestations of the mentioned vitro personally, in relation to my person, began to have their action already from the very morning of the following day, in this sense that every data for being notion about my personality, which had been before this already soundly fixed in the presences of all the beings there who knew me, suddenly sharply changed, thanks only to this objectively maleficent official presentation of me to their highest power-possessing beings. My personal significance and their notions about all my qualities and merits also changed for their individuality. I suddenly became for all important and wise, extraordinary and interesting, and so on and so forth, that is, the possessor of all kinds of abnormal being qualities brought out by themselves. As a very characteristic example which will well make clear to you what I have just said, the following illustration may serve. The proprietor of that shop where, before going to my business, I bought the provisions for my kitchen, wished on the first morning after this, as is sometimes said there, royal audience of mine, to bring, happen what may, my purchases home to me himself. All the police standing at the street corners in that district in which I temporarily dwelt, and who already knew me well as a newcomer physician, began at the sight of me, while still standing some way off, to salute just as they saluted that important general of theirs. The same evening, the chief of that department to which I first of all applied himself personally brought me to my house that unfortunate permit giving me the right to have my own laboratory, and to receive which I had languished for 3 months waiting on the doorsteps of every kind of official and unofficial establishment. And on the second day I received yet 4 other permits for this from various departments of other ministries, into whose province it did not at all enter to issue such permits, but to whom on account of this same dilly-dallying of theirs I'd had to apply during my senseless hustlings. The owners of the houses, shopkeepers, children, and in general all who dwelt in the same street as I did, became as amiable with me as if I intended to leave each of them a large American legacy, and so on and so forth. After this empty Crownian happening to me, I, by the way, further learned that this unfortunate Tsar of theirs also always prepares himself for such official meetings with beings strange to him. Of these official meetings like this he has very many, almost every day, and even several times a day, here a parade of the troops, there an audience with the ambassador of some other emperor, in the morning a delegation, at noon a presentation such as mine, later a reception of different what are called representatives of the people, and with each of these it is necessary for him to talk, or even to make them an entire speech. As each word of every such terrestrial Tsar can have, and often does have, serious consequences not only for the beings of that community of whom he is Tsar, but also for the beings of other communities, therefore each word must be thought out from every side. Well, for this, around these emperors or Tsars who become such by hereditary rights or by election, there are many specialists from among the ordinary free-brain beings there, in order that they may prompt them as to what they must do and say in every circumstance, and these promptings and directions must be carried out in such a way that the strangers may not notice that their emperor or Tsar manifests not from his own but from others' initiative. And in order to remember all this, these Tsars must of course also practice. And what it means to practice, you can probably already picture to yourself after what I have just told you. I understood this with all my being when I prepared myself for my illustrious presentation. During my existence on that planet, such a preparation, by the way, was necessary for me personally only once. Were such preparations necessary every day and for every separate occasion, then may one be spared from experiencing such a merciless fate. I personally at least would not under any conditions be in the skin of such a terrestrial emperor or czar, and would neither wish it for my very worst enemy, nor for the enemy of my nearest. After this unforgettable, supreme presentation of mine, I very soon left St. Petersburg for other parts of the continent of Europe, and began to have, as the chief places of my existence, various cities of the countries which were situated both on that same continent of Europe as well as on other continents. I was again later, many times, but for other affairs, in the same community, Russia, where during that period of the flow of time their great process there of reciprocal destruction took place, and the destruction of everything already attained by them, which this time, as I have already told you, was called by them Bolshevism. You remember I promised to relate to you about the fundamental real causes of this arch-phenomenal process. Well, it is necessary to tell you that this grievous phenomenon arises there thanks to two independent factors, the first of which is the cosmic law Solionensius, and the second is always the same abnormal conditions of ordinary being existence established by them themselves. In order that you should the better understand about both these factors, I will explain to you about each of them separately, and will begin by the cosmic law Solionensius. First of all, you must be told that all the free-brain beings, on whatever planet they may arise, and whatever exterior coating they may receive, always await the manifestations of the action of this law with impatience and with joy. Somewhat how your favourites await what are called their feasts of Easter, Bairam, Sardik, Ramadan, Kaelanian, and so on. The only difference is in this, that your favourites await these feasts of theirs with impatience, because on these holy days it has become customary among them to allow themselves to become more jolly and to booze freely, while the beings of the other planets await the action of Solionensius with impatience because, thanks to it, the need for evolving, in the sense of the acquiring of objective reason by them, increases in them by itself. As regards the causes which bring forth this same action of this cosmic law, they are for each planet different, and always flow from and depend upon what is called the common cosmic harmonious movement. Moreover, frequently for your planet Earth, what is called the centre of gravity of causes is the periodic tension of the sun of its system, which tension proceeds in its turn thanks to the influence upon this sun of a neighbouring solar system which exists under the name of Balae Artiol. In this latter system, however, such a centre of gravity of causes arises because among the number of its concentrations there is a great comet Solnit, which, according to certain known combinations of the common cosmic harmonious movement, at times approaches on its falling very near to its sun Balaeonit, which is forced by this to make a strong tension in order to maintain the path of its own falling. This tension provokes the tension of the suns of the neighbouring systems, among the number of which is the system Ors, and when the sun Ors strains itself not to change its path of falling inherent to it, this sun Ors in its turn provokes the same tension in all the concentrations of its own system, among which is also the planet Earth. The tension in all the planets acts also on the common presences of all beings arising and breeding on them, always engendering in the beings, besides desires and intentions of which they are not aware, the feeling called sacred Iabolio Nosar, or as your favourites would say, the feeling of religiousness, namely that being feeling which at times appears in the desire and striving for, as I have already said, speedier self-perfecting in the sense of objective reason. It is interesting that when this sacred feeling, or another similar to it, which was also engendered by a certain common cosmic actualization, proceeds in the common presences of your favourites, then they accept it as a symptom of certain of their numerous diseases, and in the given case, for example, they call this feeling nerves.